Well, our topic today is standardization and thinking styles. Standardization is one of the most important things that we deal with, but it's also our most important enemy at the same time. So we have always this tension between innovation and standardization. Both have to be present at quite high levels, or we don't really move forward in a chapter 3 kind of way. So this is another presentation about the underpinnings to the whole concept of improvement and that we're seeing in chapter 3, especially the more modern version of improvement, which is trying to improve everything continuously, or to the maximum extent we can. So what we have is a paradox, and some of you have seen an example of that just recently. We have on spreadsheet 1 had that issue with people using a Macintosh computer, which, is quite predictable if you've ever, worked before. And the issue is actually there with the Mac. It's a standardization issue, okay? In this case, what we encountered was basically a non-standard operating system conflict. And that was that if you want to automate things, you have to actually pass your automation or your automation communications across all members. So, when for instance, when you send somebody a spreadsheet, they have to be able to use it. Okay. That's sort of a nonsense statement in a way, right? It seems obvious. You have to use a spreadsheet. But it's actually points to a really important question. What do we mean by used? Are there cases, are there different ways to use a spreadsheet that possibly could lead to different results for some questions? That answer is definitely yes. And part of what we're doing in chapter 3, part of what this class is about, is we are posing to you the possibility of organizations that work at a higher, more connected level in order to get higher and better performance, because it's only through connections and mobilizing people's intelligence and their willingness to work that you get very high levels of performance. And then you're sort of stuck, what does that mean, mobilizing their intelligence? Well, those macros that you just wrote, now, they were pretty simple, right? Just print and move macros. But the macros that you wrote were your first experience of taking your intelligence, meaning your knowledge of how to manage that print function, capturing it so that somebody else could use that bit of knowledge. You would save somebody else time. And the reason you can save them time is they're actually using your intelligence when they click that macro button. So that is one definition of use the full intelligence of people by enabling them to use, through a clicking, in this case, of a macro button, at an analysis or a system or a process that you have developed. Notice this is a much higher level of functionality than most of you have thought in the past. Typically in the past, you would have thought of a spreadsheet being used just by being looked at or computing numbers. And that's it's a quite primitive way to look at anything that passes around an organization. They're not just documents, okay? Excuse me, that's wrong. If you think of them as just documents, then that's all you get. A document can't really influence people or help people as much as the intelligence behind the document can help. So one of the aspects of what we do that's the most important to the organization is capturing our intelligence. And the way we do that, the only way to do that, is some sort of automation code. Now that is a much more sophisticated way to think about things. In general, you probably haven't done that before. You've assumed that just a spreadsheet would work. And this would be, it's sort of a strategy. Sometimes, it is a strategy. Sometimes it's not a strategy people choose. If people are not very knowledgeable and they don't know about capturing intelligence through automation, then they actually sort of believe, that just having a spreadsheet, with a bunch of formulas actually is valuable. And so that then, even though they haven't chosen it on purpose as a strategy, it is a strategy. Okay? And most strategies that people have are not really chosen on purpose. They are just the accidents of what they knew and what they're what they're reenacting. They're reperforming things that they've done before. So we encountered this in our case because we have in this class 2 different OSs. Sometimes in the past we have had Linux users, so there were 3. So in the world today, for all practical purposes, there are more than 3, but for practical purposes, we have the Mac OS, we have the Windows, and we have Linux. Mac is actually a sort of a Linux clone with a cover on it to hide it from you, but it was developed off of a sort of a Darwin Linux-y kind of kernel. And you can get to, I forget how to do it, I haven't done it for a while, but if you're using a Mac, there's a keystroke combination you can use, and then poof, the command line, the whole Linux kind of control interface pops up, and you can do most Linux stuff on that. What we have here is great equipment. Every one of these things works. I've worked a lot with both of these. I've worked just a tiny bit with Linux, and really not satisfied with what I know about Linux. I would say, in the abstract sense, all 3 are about equally powerful in different ways. They have different strengths and weaknesses, but all are great, to the individual user. Where they are going to fall is it depends on what your definition of used is. If your strategic definition of used is that you want your organization to capture intelligence and pass it forward in automation, in accounting we would say RPA, robotic is one aspect, robotic process automation or artificial intelligence, things like that, then you have to pick one of these and get on that horse, because the software that does advanced form of use doesn't float happily across these platforms. Some of it, pieces of it could. For instance, I ask you to do Python for a number of reasons. Why did I ask you to do Python? Well, guess what? You can actually run Python on all 3 of these. Python works perfectly on all 3. So there is a layer of this, quote, use, where it doesn't matter what operating system. But if you are going to be in business, that means you're going to be sharing Office files, Excel and Word. And we only talked about macros in Excel rather, but you can write a macro in Word just as well. We're not going to do it in this class because as accountants, we focus a little bit more on Excel. But you can write macros in Word. It's the same VBA. It works the same. Same type of control possibilities. So if you're in business today, that means you need to send and receive Microsoft Office documents. And the only way to have advanced form of use in those is in the Windows interface. The VBA doesn't work, at least so far. It might, in the future, but I mean, next year they could fix this and this whole argument is gone. But for right now, it doesn't work. So is this a big deal? Well, this means that if you're running a business today, it's not really legitimate to run either of those 2 systems if you've defined this as high-level communication and process automation and process integration. If that's your definition of use, then you have only one choice. Well, actually, there is no choice. It's Windows only. If you have a different definition of use, then it all falls apart. If all you're going to do is share flat files that have no intelligence in them, it doesn't matter what you do, because all 3 of these can run. They can edit Word Microsoft Office documents just fine. So here's the question about or not the question. Here's the point I'm making about standardization. It depends on what you want to. You have to be very careful about why you're standardizing. If you just standardize randomly, you can make a totally incorrect decision. For instance, you can just say, some people say, oh, we need to standardize. Oh yeah, standardization is good. And they're right, standardization is good, but it's also bad. Because there are always 2 or 3 smart ways to standardize and 1,000 really stupid ways to standardize on the wrong thing. If you standardize on the wrong thing, you make everything worse. Okay? So you have to be really, really sharp and study this very deeply to say, why is it that we care? And if we don't care about this, if we're going to say, for the next 5 years, the state of organization that we're in, honestly, we're not going to be able to loft up to the next level and do more integrated stuff. It's not going to happen. We can't do that. At that point, you can say, heck, doesn't matter. Let people choose what they want. They'll be happier. We can still sell files. They can use Google Docs if they want. So that is a smart decision. And if someone said they did that, someone told me that they consciously said, no, we're not going to be integrating because it's not in our path right now. We don't have the money, the funds, whatever stresses we're under. It's not rational to do that, and we're pretty sure in the next 3 to 4 year horizon that's not going to happen. And then I'd say, shoot, do whatever you want. In fact, at that point, I might actually tilt over and say Mac. I almost never do Linux, not because Linux is not good, Linux is fantastic. Actually, it's really good, but it's really good for people that want to work a little harder. So, if you want to do the Linux thing, I think it's wonderful, but it's a lot harder than either of the other two. It's for people that care and want to learn deep stuff about how things are going. So I wouldn't say any organization should standardize on Linux currently because the training cost is going to be sky high. Linux is potentially, supposedly free, and a lot of the software is free for Linux, but the training cost can be astronomical because you can't it's hard to hire people off the street with Linux knowledge. If you want to be all Linux all the time, you're going to have a training, some training system to handle this. So I would never do this, even though actually it's good stuff. The Mac, if your use case is disconnected work, then the lowest TCO is Mac. That's a concept called total cost of ownership. In the disconnected environment, the Mac has the lowest total cost of ownership because it just doesn't break very often. It doesn't invite you to do stupid things. People tend not to play around under the hood and make foolish decisions on the Mac. Also, the Mac doesn't really let you go, too many places where you can do something silly. And also because there are not too many options in the Mac, there's not a lot of variety, and so there's not a lot of choices. And so where you get in trouble is if you have software with a lot of choices and people go down different paths, stuff breaks, you have to call a technician. And so the Mac actually, if you are in a disconnected environment where you don't share high-level communications, the Mac is probably the way to go. And it'll be the cheapest, lowest total cost of ownership. If, on the other hand, you decide strategically to go in the Chapter 3 direction and you want higher levels of integration and automation and RPA, Windows will be the lowest TCO, okay? And if you do both, Windows and Mac, you have absolutely the crazy highest cost of everything. Your training cost almost doubles for certain components of training. Difficulty of hiring technicians is higher. It's hardware, meaning support hardware like cables, is more expensive in that world. So the worst case, meaning most expensive case, is to actually allow both. Cheapest is Windows for an integrated environment. For a disintegrated environment, though, cheapest would be Mac. So notice, even though standardization is good, we always have to think about that because it can potentially save us. It saves us errors, problems all the time. If we standardize on the wrong thing, then it will actually magnify, whatever chaos, happens. So if you want to be high integration and you standardize on the Mac, kaboom, or if you don't standardize, that's when you have the kaboom. If you have low integration demands, then standardizing on Mac could be the correct thing. So the answer is never always standardize on Mac or always standardize on Windows or always standardize on Linux. Standardization should be based on what's critical to you or what can hurt you or where you're weak. Okay, and one place we're all weak is actually training. What's the lowest training cost? It's usually Mac. What's the highest training cost? Like hugely higher, Linux. What's higher than the Mac but still fairly low is Windows training cost, because most people come in knowing something about Windows, so you don't have to train them that much. So here is the topic for today, and I digressed because some of you, and through the chat line, you've seen that we've had some problems with that in the current semester, and we always will, because it's just the way things happen. So the issue in standardization is, for us, this creates thinking boxes for us. What do I mean by thinking boxes? Well, in our lives, we tend to have patterns of thinking that determine what we do, and yet we don't really consider them explicitly, and they keep us from making certain types of decisions, and they're all over the place. And one is, if you're 100% Windows users and you're never used a Mac, you'll sneer at it. You'll say you have a lot of thoughts about Macs that are contemptuous, and you'll say stuff, but you have no experience. You don't actually know anything about the Mac. And Mac users, of course, are the same way. They are contemptuous of Windows users, and they have their reason, usually without experience on either side. But even if you don't have experience, people generate opinions. So in a way, a thinking box is when you generate a lot of opinions, or you have a lot of opinions that are not anchored to facts. Now, standardization creates boxes of thinking, or what I call thinking boxes, meaning standardization helps when you do it right, but it also stops certain types of thinking. So it is inherently dangerous. Standardization is inherently dangerous. We have to do it because our world wouldn't work without it, but every time we do it, we put ourselves in a box where we will fail to consider some important issues based on the fact that we have a standard. We will no longer address that standard. Okay? Examples of standards: everything you see and everything you touch is based on a standard. 120 volt electricity. If you have a screw, look at a screw, those threads, those are international standards. How far apart the threads are, how deep they are, the angles, the cut angles. What is a kilometer? It's a standard. What is a mile? A standard. An inch is a standard. Nothing that we have would be possible without having hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of layers of standards. And so they're crucial because a standard is what allows us to capture value. Innovation can create value, but it never captures value. It's the standardization that captures the value. And so both of them have to be used, but both of them are a little bit dangerous. Today we're talking about the standardization, the dangers of standardization. Mainly because, for the most part, the benefits are sort of obvious, and we know that. But the standardization thinking box that's created is a danger because it stops our thinking. Now, I'll give you a couple of examples from your life, or, I'm going to spin a few stories to try and make this make sense to you. So, imagine you find a time machine, right? And you transport yourself back to, say, 1920 or 1925. Well, the people that you encounter back then would have a very different way of thinking about certain issues, and one that you could make a lot of money with. Imagine you go to the southern part of the U.S., and it's 1920, 1925. I'll tell you what, if you started a company, like an insurance company or something that had a lot of back office work, you know what? If you hired black women, you would make so much money because they can't get a job. And that they're as smart as anybody else. They work as hard as anybody else. But down there, think about this. Down there in Alabama and Mississippi and Florida, the people that own companies don't believe that. Their thinking boxes, they never even think about black women at all. They don't, and the black women have a double whammy. They're black, they're women. They get sort of double oppression. double disrespect. So if you were transported back there with your current ideas about what's right and what's wrong and who can work hard and who's a decent human being, which would be different from the thinking box that the society was in back then, guess what? You could start a whole company where you hired all black women, right? And they, just think, that company would be unstoppable because you could unleash the intelligence and the spirit that they had. And you could take that for, black women. Hire all homosexuals. They got treated even worse than black women back then. And you know what? Guess what we know today? They're smart, right? They work hard. If you respect them, imagine a company that was formed like that. You could energize that intelligence, and they would also be loyal to you because you were actually treating them reasonably. It can, go farther. Now that seems pretty obvious to you. I spun a little story there. It was a bit extreme, and you can see, oh yeah, if I was back there, the way I think would actually make me a different person than those people, and I would be able to make different decisions. How about in 1925, you go to Quebec and you hire all Francophones? The situation was not as violent and as oppressive, but it was heading in that same direction. It was pretty oppressive. If you were a Francophone, even a university-educated Francophone, you were a second-tier citizen in Quebec. The Anglophile, meaning English-speaking, English-loving community, treated you with complete contempt. And your career path was totally different. If you went 1920, 1925, you start a company like an insurance company, you hire all Francophones, treat everyone with respect, you would mobilize a tremendous amount of value there, right? Because of being in a different box. Now, that's, I'm giving you, often in the class when I tell you a story or trying to illustrate something, I give you an extreme example. It's much easier to see these examples when they're sort of far away and crazy, like big differences. Now, back to us today, these thinking boxes. Guess what? We have them too, and we don't see them, and there's something out there. And, I know they're out there, and I try and think about it. But because I'm in my 2021 old white guy box, there are things I know I don't see. Because of what I teach and knowing this material, I'm a little bit more aware that something is out there, but I also don't see it with clarity. What is it that is out there that you don't see? I can tell you one thing that some people don't see and that Canada doesn't see is for immigrants, university-educated immigrants, especially people like engineering immigrants from Pakistan or India or even Malaysia. A lot of those universities are really, really good, and those degrees are really, really tough, and we underemploy them because we don't see them. And when someone says, I have an engineering degree from the University of Pakistan, the people, the white Canadian guys who are hiring them, they go, oh, what does that even mean? Did you go to U of T? It's like, goes over their head. And I know of a couple of companies in Canada that actually specialize in looking for and hiring these people because they're underutilized. And the old line Canadian companies don't hire them. That's a thinking box. And there are others. So I want to pose to you that you are surrounded by opportunities that you don't see, just like those people, the white guys in Alabama, didn't see the black women. They just didn't exist as a business opportunity. The same thing happens to you. There are things you don't see because of the path you're on, because of the thinking box, because of what you've been standardized to see. I speculate that one would be university education. This is going to happen to you. I guarantee this will happen to everyone in here. You are graduating when, or you're attending, and will hopefully graduate from a pretty tough degree program. I will bet that already you guys are somewhat sneering and contemptuous of BBA majors, and especially like a Brock English majors. You don't respect them. Big mistake. That's, you've sort of standardized. You've locked yourself in a box. Are they capable of doing the stuff you're doing? They may not be capable of it now, but that doesn't mean that, what we're doing, I think it's cool. you'll think it's cool probably at some point. I think it's beneficial no matter what you do, whether you become an accountant or not, wherever your career leads you. What you're learning with us will be beneficial to you. But is it the most important thing in the world? Nah. It's good school stuff, but it's not. You can't really argue that it's the most important thing in the world. So some of the people you're sneering at now, like those English majors or sociology majors or the BBA marketing majors, that's bad. The fact that you have that feeling in your, stomach, heart, wherever you have deep feelings, that is an example of this. And it is bad. Anytime you have contempt or any kind of feeling of condescension for another person, that should trigger like an alarm bell in your head that says, okay, I'm using some bad thinking here. I'll give you one little example of that. I've had some experience in places where we're doing improvement activities, and I guarantee you, do it, and this, like at hospitals, you have to improve. One that I have, this was like a 3-day project. We were trying to figure out how to get X-rays done faster in the emergency room of a hospital near us. Bring everybody in, and of course, they didn't want to cooperate, because we wanted to bring in the physicians, the nurses, the administrators, hospital, professional managers and stuff. And we said, but we also need to bring in the orderlies and the custodians. And they almost wouldn't let us do that because they said, what can those guys offer us? Well, guess what? We knew, because we've done this before, is that they're going to have the best ideas. The custodians and the orderlies in every organization, and whatever place you go to, they will often have the highest number of good ideas. And it happened at this hospital, is that the largest number of good improvement activity ideas for the emergency room X-ray system was from one specific hospital orderly that only had high school education. She came up with more ideas than any of the physicians, any of the managers, any of the nurses. She's an innovative person. And yet, she didn't look that cool. She just looked like some sort of middle-aged hospital orderly, like someone, high school education. But we had her, when it was set up, once you've done this for a while, you know this, right? That, after you do a few improvement exercises, you say, we include everybody, because that down the people that are at the bottom of the organization in the social and money sense, they're smart too and they're innovative. But the people above them don't even see them, because the Canada, the thinking boxes, I have a university degree. What are you? Just, a hospital orderly? And I wish I could put alarm bells around everybody's ears. Every time somebody condescends to somebody, I'd like a buzz to go off into their ears. And so, but that is related to this. You have standardized on what you think is important. University degrees are important. Being a CPA is important. Being a physician is important. Being a nurse is important. Everybody else is, not as important. If you're moving in the chapter 3 direction, that's a trap. The only way you have to undo that some way. So these thinking boxes are pervasive. You'll never get rid of them. You'll never conquer this. It will be a life adventure to be aware of them. And what I'm hoping that I do is make you aware of it now. I deliberately try and expose mine just to myself. I don't usually, Another word for this is your prejudices and your biases. I usually don't use that word in class because those two words, they have sort of taken a negative connotation, because usually when we talk about prejudice or bias, we're talking about something racial or ethnic. But those are real prejudices, but there are others. Basically every opinion you have without information is a form of prejudice or bias. So I'll tell you what, I love to travel. Because of my career, I have opportunities to go to different countries and stay for a week or 2 weeks. I give lectures, walk around. And I have a notebook that I take when I travel, and how I told you guys to draw a line? So this is the notebook, What I do is I draw a line down the middle of the paper, and, on one side I write all the cool things that these foreigners do in this country, like cool Brazilian things. And on the other side, I write really stupid Brazilian things, like these guys are idiots. Why are they doing this? But what I'm trying to do is capture my prejudices, because I don't know all of my prejudices. But at different times when you see something, if I have an emotional reaction to it, I try and write it down. And I have both sides. I see stuff that they do, and I go, wow, that's cool. I never saw that before. And I see, man, what is it with this? Like, what, this is dumb. Because it's important to me, you can tell I talk about this, to capture it so I can think about it and say, why did I think that thought? I don't want to, when I encounter one of my biases or prejudices, or in class, call it thinking boxes, I want to know why I did that, Because it was sort of, I want to think, was that smart or dumb that I had that idea? Now, if I'm lucky enough to stay in the country for 2 weeks, what I always find is that I move stuff back and forth. A lot of the things that I thought were stupid in my first 2 or 3 days, I change my mind. After you've been someplace for a while and you look around and you learn a little bit more about life and how they work, you go, oh, I see, that was actually a smart idea. But because I was in a box and I was applying my Canadian thinking to this, I thought it was stupid, but actually that's smart. And so this is a game I play with myself. The game is exposing yourself and capturing your biases and prejudices as they come. I don't know. Is it valuable? I don't know. It gives me insight into working with people, and it has definitely opened me up to accepting people more. Because when I do it, I realize that, or when I started doing this, I realized that many of the things I thought were stupid actually turned out to be smart. But also vice versa. Many of the things I thought were smart later turned out to be stupid. And it made me a little bit more flexible and open. If you want to be an entrepreneur and start your own company, how are successful companies started? By someone that breaks out of some kind of box. Are you going to explode out of a box? No. Coming out of the box is little. There are little changes, little things that you observe, but they're related to standardization and your thinking boxes. What do you think about? Notice that in this case, that Windows, Mac, and Linux thing, the box that people are in when they address this, and why, if you look up lowest total cost of ownership, you're going to find that on Google. Go Google it. The answer is always going to be Mac. And you're just going to say, oh, it's Mac. Well, guess what? Look at the test they applied and what they decided the use case was. And you'll see that every one that you find out there describes the Mac as a low total cost of ownership only because they haven't thought about communicating macros and other intelligence across. Right? Because they're in a box about what the use case is. And so once they define that in a certain way, meaning just exchanging files, then you get one answer. If you define it in a different way, you get a different answer. The guys who write this, when you Google them, they only know one answer, which is disconnected organizations. These are a lot of staff writers for computer magazines. And you know what? They don't do anything that is integrated. They just write articles. So they have the right answer for that circumstance. But this then affects everything we do, and it affects our ability to move into using the Chapter 3 material. I have mentioned quite a number of things that do that. That KM idea, the operating doctrine affects your ability to use Chapter 3 material. Your thought about standardization and thinking and how it traps you also impacts. Because here is the lesson, one of the big lessons we learned from Toyota. At Toyota, all standards are temporary. That's a huge part of their philosophy. Toyota is probably the most standardized organization, practically on the planet. They're not just standardized. They are hyper, crazy, standardized to the maximum. If you're working on a Toyota factory line, and you're doing something, the instructions to you don't say screw this bolt in. They say you have to pick up this tool with your right hand. You have to hold the nut in your left hand. You have to bring the nut and the tool together, and then you have to insert it in the hole. And then you have to, go till you have however many, how much torque, however Newton meters or inch, foot-pounds or however you're measuring torque, you have to go into how much torque you're using. And that you have to do that. You don't have the discretion to put the screw in and do it tighten with your finger and then attach the tool to it. No. They actually have the standards set to the point where it's which hand, how you pick it up, how the contact is made. But at Toyota, remember we talked about Kaizen in Chapter 3 and improvements. At Toyota, you know what their goal is for improvements? Is actually changes in the standard. So they consider that changing the standard is the most important type of improvement. And so when in the past I've talked about improvements, or you read about improvements in Kaizen at Toyota or anywhere, at Toyota they do it in their own particular way, and a number of companies do this. Toyota is probably the most extreme. Is the main thing they focus on is to improve the standard itself. And so part of their culture is to say all standards are temporary. Why do they do this? Because they know that every standard does two things. It creates a thinking box, but you also standardize on stupid stuff. Because when you adopt something as a standard, you adopt it for its good and its bad aspects. If you adopt Windows as a standard, which would be obviously, my choice, is it because Windows is wonderful? No, it's sort of sucky, like Windows does really dumb stuff, and it's hard to control. It has features that mean that I think still it's the best choice for business in 2021. But when you standardize on Windows, you're standardizing on the smart good stuff like the VBA that can move across. But you're also standardizing on some pretty ridiculous security aspects, meaning, you don't know this, but and it's changing through time, they're better at it. But when you look at Windows software from Microsoft, you can sort of tell that the security routines were written by different people because they don't function the same way. And so your technical staff, sometimes, you'll find them at their office, like leaning with their head going, well, because it's a standard. And standards always have good pieces, because if you standardize on what you really need, it benefits you. But at the same time, each of those standards also has little pain points. There's no such thing as a standard that's so wonderful that it doesn't have some pieces that are stupid to it. Okay? So that's why all standards should be temporary. Everything. If you have a standard that doesn't change in a year, it should send off an alarm bell. Like, why? Could this possibly be correct that we should still be doing this a year later? And maybe the answer is yes. Sometimes it would be. Some low-level standards, like should we be using electricity in 120 volts? You're probably not going to change that too often. But above that, in terms of processes, software, like are you going to use Python or not? Well, I believe, I'm convinced right now and probably for the next 4 or 5 years, Python's the best way to enter the analysis market. But there are other pieces of software that have good features that in some ways a couple of features might be a little bit better in Python. They might be easing Python out. So what you will probably see is in that market, if some of you decide that you think it's cool, the analysis issue, and you double down and you take more Python courses, in the next 4 to 5 years, you'll probably pick up another language that might be on the way up and Python might be on the way down, right? Because Python is where I would standardize now. But it definitely is not perfect. It has, it's not very efficient with machines, right? It's a hog. It's not very efficient with CPU time and with memory. But, it's free. It's everywhere. A lot of people know it, so it has some really good features too. So standardization is good and bad. If you standardize on what's important to you, it has huge benefits, but you should always be nervous because anytime you standardize, it creates bad thinking. All standards create some type of bad thinking. And all standards also contain defects, so that the standard itself has problems in it that you will have to work with. And so you should consider, the Toyota approach is to say that the highest goal of all managers, the most important thing managers can do at Toyota is propose a change in the standards. Okay? So that's where Toyota sort of created a totally different way to think about this stuff, which is they're both the most standardized, and at the same time, they're the organization whose standards change the fastest. Okay? If we look at previous to Chapter 3, meaning the sort of Anglo-Axis, Western, top-down manager-led decision-making, we use standards a lot, and you'll see in Chapter 7 and 8, standard costing. But what we did is the mentality was different, and we thought when we set this standard, we'll keep that standard like forever. And it was a giant problem that we didn't realize. That's one reason that Japanese firms were so successful in the 70s and 80s and 90s, and even to today, is they're much faster at changing standards. And we tend to still be slow. Part of our mentality, the Western mentality, is once we adopt a standard, we don't have a cultural mechanism that says change it because we are M, we're not K. Remember? So this rolls back then and picks up that K idea. Or actually, I should always say KM. There's no such thing as K by itself. In KM, the K motivates the change in the standard. If you're just an M organization, you have no ethical responsibility to change a standard, so they'll drift along. You'll have the same standard, like same cost standard, for 10 years, and just bad, just chaos. So this is crucial to the functioning of what we do in Chapter 3, which is the development of the tip over to thinking about improvement and creativity as being a core business idea. And also, at this point, we've pulled together enough of the pieces that you can start to see the picture, which is, and on another piece I want to mention before I close off there, is historically Western managers, Canadian managers, tended to be uncomfortable with too much innovation and change because it created chaos. Okay? Every time you change something, it's like this giant problem. Well, that was true, but it created chaos because you didn't do it very often. And if you're not experienced with doing something and you don't change very often, and then when you change, you do a giant change, it's totally chaos. If you're changing little things all the time, you develop your skill. You become very good at continuous changing. The people on the line become used to giving ideas and thinking that their intelligence matters, and they become skilled at agreeing to change over to a new process or new piece of equipment. Like they'll suggest, look, we need a new, this isn't working. We need a new impact driver, new style of impact driver. They will become used to that because changes are happening. So what we have, when we start bringing all this stuff together, we have the techniques in Chapter 3. Chapter 3 is more technique heavy. But then we have the social and human aspect, which is the IKM model, plus this different view of standardization. Now, part of the paradox is I did not mention innovation. But innovation is that other part. Innovation is the change in standard. When you innovate, change a standard. How do you make money? Standards. How do you create the possibility of making money? Innovation. But innovation doesn't make money. Why does Apple make money? They're the most standardized. Apple is wildly more standardized than Microsoft. Microsoft's basically out of control. Too many new products. If you talk about innovation, who innovates the most? Like 10 times. Microsoft innovates 10 times more than Apple does. What does Apple do? Apple figured out what we really needed, and then they locked the system down so that there's no choice. In the Apple universe, your choices are very limited, but they're so smart. They came up with the choices that people liked and were willing to pay a lot of money for. How does Apple make that money? Standardization. It was never made from innovation. And this is one reason that Microsoft is less profitable than Apple. They just come up they have 100 new products a year, and a lot of them fail. So they basically just throw stuff out there, say, does it work? Well, if it doesn't work, we'll do something else. So they're doing a lot of stuff like that, but they're not really thinking deeply about what people need. They're just on the technical side, just inventing stuff. Where do you make money? You make money through standardization. Where do you create the possibility to make money? Through innovation. These are always in tension. There's no really great way to management. Nobody is happy with how they manage this process. Not Toyota, not Scott. Nobody's happy because it's always uncertainty You know, like that task level instruction thing, you did the spreadsheet. This is the big boy version of that, you know. Innovate, you know, how much do you innovate? How much do you standardize? What's your budget on each? How do you know, when someone comes up with a new idea, well, I'm not going to make any money off this idea until every store is doing this. Like if you're McDonald's or you're Taco Bell, someone comes up with a new product. Okay, great idea. How do we make money off of that? We have to figure out how to get the same product to be sold in 10,000 stores, right? So we have to standardize the instructions, the portion size, the delivery, the contact with the suppliers, the quality. That's how McDonald's makes money. Not from a new idea, it's from the standardization. But how do they get the possibility of making money? It's from the innovation. So these are all tied together in a very tight way. Chapter 3 and what we learned from the Japanese gives us a different way to handle that than what we had before. Okay? So let me take a quick look at my notes here. Okay, so that is it. What we need you to do is, at this point, watch those 2 videos that are up there. And then before you look at the next video in the sequence, you should look at the Dan Pink video and the manufacturing production video. And that will be, we still have like another class day of this pre-stuff where we're not really doing accounting things with numbers yet. We're trying to get your thinking ready so that you can approach it in a different way. For today's, after you finish this video, then watch the 2 pre-done videos, the Dan Pink link on YouTube and the manufacturing process video. Then watch the next video that I record where I'm going to discuss aspects of those 2 videos. And that will be close to the end of the big pre-work, the theory work that we do to bring us into chapter 4, which is when we start doing debits and credits and all that, fine accounting kind of stuff. So that's all I have for standardization and thinking boxes. And I'm going to tell you, if you can figure out some of the boxes you're in, you can break out a little bit. You can be one of the people, and you won't be the only one. You'll be one of the people that looks around and sees, what are we missing? What am I not seeing? Who am I not valuing that has something to offer? Okay? That would be pretty cool. That's it for today.